Welcome to the final video of the French Revolution. In this video, we're going to discuss about the political instability in France, about the women's revolution, the abolition of slavery in France, everyday life during the revolution, and about Napoleon Bonaparte. So in the previous video, we saw that the death of Robespierre led to the fall of the Jacobin government. This led to the rise of the middle class that seized power. A new constitution came about that denied the vote to non-property members of the society. Two legislative councils were created which could appoint a directory, which was the executive, made up of 5 members that would rule France. This was to avoid the concentration of power into a single person. The directors, however, often clashed with the legislative councils, who then dismissed them. This led to political instability in France, which led to the rise of military dictator Napoleon Bonaparte. Let's talk about the women's revolution. Women were always an important part of the French Revolution. They hoped that their involvement would pressurize the revolutionary government to introduce laws in their favor. They worked as seamstresses, laundresses, sold flowers and fruits at the markets, or were domestic servants at the house of prominent people. Only the daughters of nobles could actually study at convents, after which they were forced into marriage by their family. Women had to look after their families, and their wages were always lower than that of men. As the revolution progressed, women started their own political clubs and newspapers. Around 60 women's clubs came up, the most famous one of which was the Society of Revolutionary and Republican Women. Their main demand was that women have equal political rights as men. However, they were disappointed with the Constitution of 1791 that denied these women the right to vote and reduced them to passive citizens. They demanded the right to vote, to be elected to the assembly, and to hold political office. Only then they believed their interests would be represented in the government. In the early years, the revolutionary government did introduce reforms that were in favor of women. For example, schooling was made compulsory for all girls. Fathers couldn't force women into marriage. Marriage was made into a contract that could be entered into freely and was registered under the law. Divorce was made legal. Both women and men could apply for it. Women could train for jobs, become artists, or run businesses. However, women's struggle continued. In the reign of terror, the new government issued laws ordering the closure of women's clubs and banning all of their political activities. Many prominent women were arrested and executed. This fight continued for the next 200 years. Finally, in 1946, women finally won the right to vote. Let's talk about slavery in French colonies. The most revolutionary social reform of the Jacobin government was the abolition of slavery in French colonies. So how did slavery begin in France? Understand that France had colonies of the Caribbean that were important suppliers of tobacco, indigo, sugar, and coffee. However, Europeans were reluctant to go work in distant and unfamiliar lands, which led to the shortage of labor in the plantations. This kicked off a triangular slave trade between Europe, Africa, and America, which began in the 17th century. French merchants sailed to African coasts where they bought slaves, which were packed tightly into ships for a 3-month-long voyage across the Atlantic to the Caribbean, where these slaves were sold to plantation owners and were exploited. This exploitation made it possible to meet the growing demand for sugar, coffee, and indigo. Throughout the 18th century, there was no criticism of slavery in these French colonies. The National Assembly, however, did hold debates of whether the rights of man should be extended to these slaves or not. However, fearing the opposition of businessmen who depended on these slaves, they did not pass any laws on this. The convention in 1794 legislated to free all slaves in French overseas possessions. However, this was a short-term measure. Napoleon reintroduced slavery. Plantation owners understood their freedom as including the right to enslave African people in pursuit of their economic interests. Slavery was finally abolished in 1848. Let's talk about the everyday life during the revolution. So the years following 1789 saw a huge change in the way people wore their clothes, in the kind of books that people read, and the kind of language they spoke. The most important law after 1789 was the abolition of censorship. In the old regime, content could be publicized only after it was approved by the censors of the king. However, in the Declaration of the Right of man and citizens. It made it possible for people to publish their own content without it being approved by the government. This led to the freedom of press, which led to opposing views of events that could be expressed. Each side sought to convince others of its position. Plays and songs and festive processions attracted a large number of people. This was one way to explain to people the revolutionary political ideas that were put forth by these political philosophers in France during that time. Let's talk about Napoleon Bonaparte. In 1804, Napoleon Bonaparte crowned himself the Emperor of France. He set to conquer the neighboring countries where he placed his family members. Napoleon saw his role as the modernizer of Europe. He introduced laws such as the protection of private property, uniform system of weights and measures. Initially, many people saw Napoleon as a liberator. However, his armies soon came to be viewed as an invading force. Finally, he was defeated in Waterloo in 1815. Many of his measures influenced people and had a lasting impact on the people of Europe. Liberty and democratic rights are the most important legacy of the French Revolution that spread from France to the rest of Europe and finally to the rest of the world. Tipu Sultan and Ram Mohan Roy are two of the many individuals that were influenced by this revolution. So this was the French Revolution, guys. If you liked these videos, please subscribe to our channel. Thank you.